Imagine building a tunnel beneath a divided city to secretly listen to your greatest enemy. Now imagine discovering years later that the enemy already knew about it. That was Operation Gold. In the middle of the Cold War, Berlin was more than a divided city. It was a frontier between two superpowers, where every piece of information could have military value. The Soviet Union controlled East Berlin. America, Britain, and France controlled the West. And beneath that border ran something intelligence officers desperately wanted to reach: Soviet military communication cables. The problem was simple. They couldn't tap them from the other side. So the CIA and Britain's MI6 came up with an extraordinary solution. They would dig underneath Berlin. History remembers the victories. Dark Atlas uncovers the secrets buried beneath them. If you enjoy true stories of espionage, secret operations, and hidden history, subscribe to Dark Atlas. And if you have a question while watching, leave it in the comments. Now, let's go back to Berlin. In 1954, engineers began secretly excavating from West Berlin toward the Soviet communication lines. On the surface, almost nothing appeared unusual. Underground, everything had to be controlled. The tunnel would eventually stretch roughly 450 meters and be only about 6 feet wide. But digging it was only half the problem. Thousands of tons of soil had to disappear without revealing that a tunnel was being built. The solution was to hide the excavated earth inside an American facility. Above the workers, Berlin continued as normal. People walked through the streets. Cars passed overhead. East German authorities patrolled their side of the border. And beneath them, British and American technicians were quietly moving toward the Soviet cables. Think about that for a moment. Every shovel of earth had to remain hidden. Every vibration mattered. Every person who discovered the wrong detail could expose the entire operation. Then, after months of work, the engineers reached their target. The cables were there. The listening equipment was installed. And in 1955, Operation Gold began collecting Soviet communications. For the Americans and British, it appeared to be an extraordinary intelligence success. They had found a way to listen directly to a military network on the other side of the Iron Curtain. But there was something they didn't know. Someone inside British intelligence already knew about the tunnel. His name was George Blake. Blake was secretly working for Soviet intelligence, and he passed information about the operation to the KGB. So while the Americans believed they had created a secret tunnel beneath East Berlin, Moscow already knew the tunnel existed. And this is where the story becomes almost impossible to explain. The Soviets could have exposed it. They could have shut it down. They could have arrested the people involved. But they didn't. Instead, they let the Americans keep listening. Why would the KGB allow one of the most sensitive communications networks in the Soviet bloc to be secretly monitored? The answer would remain hidden for years. The reason was George Blake. He wasn't a Soviet soldier. He wasn't hiding behind the tunnel walls. He was a British intelligence officer who had secretly chosen to work for Moscow. And by the time the tunnel was being built, the KGB already knew what the Americans and British were trying to do. But exposing the tunnel would expose Blake. So the Soviets made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable. They let it continue. For the people working underground, nothing had changed. The equipment kept running. The tapes kept turning. And day after day, Soviet communications flowed into the listening station beneath Berlin. The operation was producing an enormous amount of information. Telephone conversations, military communications, teletype traffic. Analysts on the western side began studying the material for clues about Soviet forces, military organization, and the growing East German military. The tunnel wasn't a failure. It was actually working, and that created an extraordinary situation. The Americans were secretly listening to the Soviets. The Soviets knew they were being listened to, yet the information being collected was still valuable. This is where some versions of the story become exaggerated. You may hear that the KGB simply filled the cables with fake information and turned the entire operation into a giant deception. The evidence is more complicated. The available historical record indicates that substantial genuine intelligence was collected. The Soviets had a powerful reason to tolerate the operation, protecting George Blake. As long as the tunnel remained active, the KGB could protect their source. And there was another advantage. If the Americans believed the tunnel was still secret, they had no reason to suspect that someone inside their own intelligence network had betrayed them. So the operation continued for almost 11 months. Thousands of reels of recordings accumulated underground. But while the Americans were concentrating on what they were hearing, the Soviets were waiting. Then, in April 1956, nature created the opportunity they needed. Heavy rain caused problems with underground communications cables. Soviet and East German personnel began investigating. On the night of April 21, repair workers moved into the area where the hidden installation was located. They weren't searching for an American spy tunnel. At least, that's how the discovery appeared. Then they found an opening. Behind it was a passage, and beyond that passage was the tunnel. The secret that had taken years to build had suddenly become impossible to hide. For the Americans, it looked like a disaster. The operation had been exposed. The Soviets could now enter the tunnel, photograph the equipment, and show the world exactly what the West had been doing beneath East Berlin. But there was something the Americans still didn't understand. They thought the Soviets had discovered the tunnel because of an accident. They didn't know that Moscow had known about it long before the first Soviet soldier entered it. And they certainly didn't know that the man responsible was still protected. The tunnel had been compromised from the beginning. But the CIA wouldn't fully understand that until years later. The tunnel was now exposed to the world. Soviet officials condemned it as an illegal act of espionage and opened the site to journalists. Photographs showed the narrow passage, the listening equipment, and the extraordinary engineering operation hidden beneath Berlin. For the CIA and MI6, it was an embarrassing ending. But they still believed they had been caught by accident. They were wrong. The real betrayal would not become clear until 1961, when George Blake was arrested and his secret relationship with Soviet intelligence was exposed. Only then did the full meaning of Operation Gold begin to emerge. The Americans had spent years planning a tunnel beneath the Iron Curtain. They had hidden thousands of tons of soil. They had reached the Soviet communication network. And for almost 11 months, they had collected an enormous amount of information. But the enemy had known. The KGB had allowed the operation to continue because Blake was more valuable as a protected source than the tunnel was as a secret. That creates one of the strangest paradoxes of the Cold War. The operation was technically successful. The tunnel worked. The listening equipment worked. And substantial genuine intelligence was collected. But from a counterintelligence perspective, the operation had been compromised before it was even completed. And that is what makes Operation Gold more than a story about a secret tunnel. It is a story about trust. The Americans were looking through a wall they believed protected their secret. But the real weakness wasn't underground. It was inside their own intelligence network. Imagine being one of the engineers who spent months building that tunnel. You know every measurement, every cable, every section of steel, every risk. You believe the secret depends on your ability to keep it hidden. Then years later, you discover that someone had already told the enemy what you were doing. what would you feel? Pride in what you accomplished? Or anger that the secret had never really been yours to protect? That question is part of the legacy of Operation Gold. The tunnel eventually disappeared, but the intelligence it produced continued to be studied long after the operation ended. And the story left behind a lesson that applies far beyond the Cold War. The most sophisticated technology cannot protect a secret from the person who already knows it. So what do you think? Was Operation Gold a brilliant intelligence victory because it produced valuable information despite the betrayal? Or was it ultimately a counterintelligence failure because the KGB knew from the beginning? Tell me your answer in the comments. And if you have a question about Operation Gold, ask it there too. If there is another Cold War mystery, secret operation, disaster, or forgotten story you want Dark Atlas to uncover next, tell me. Your question could become our next documentary. And if you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, subscribe to Dark Atlas for more true stories the world forgot.